All right, welcome in everyone. Diving right in today, we're going to tackle well, it's a pretty crucial one, right? The whole US-Ukraine relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
And, tons of you sent in this Ukraine and America script
Allies at a crossroads.
from that Global Pulse podcast. So,
Fun.
yeah, like we'll break down kind of the historical backdrop, right?
Right.
The aid packages, military, economic, the whole 9 yards,
Yeah.
and the debates surrounding that support, because there's definitely some back and forth there. And of course, we got to talk about corruption, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's a big factor. And then, we'll look at the human cost, what's the impact on everyday people, and of course, try and pick into the crystal ball a little bit, see what the future might hold for this alliance,
Yeah.
Kind of a critical one on the world stage right now. So, mission here is, we're extracting the core insights for you guys, try and make sense of this whole geopolitical puzzle.
I think what struck me just diving into the script was, it's framed as a conversation, right?
Yeah.
And I think it gives you a really good sense of uh, how people are actually processing these huge issues, like not just in the halls of power, but, in the public sphere.
Right, right. So how is this actually landing?
And I think Anna and Mark, the hosts, do a really good job. They cover a lot of ground from, like right after the Soviet Union collapsed, like super early days.
Like super tentative.
Yeah, hesitant, all the
Yeah.
way up to the, massive assistance that we're seeing today.
Yeah, so let's rewind a bit, right? Like
Yeah.
early 90s, USSR is gone. The script points out that, the US-Ukraine relationship, it was, I don't know, kind of lukewarm, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the U.S. was doing its own kind of recalibration, right?
Yeah.
After the Cold War, like, what's the world look like now?
Right.
So there's this period of assessment, figuring out, where are all these newly independent states going, Ukraine included.
Yeah.
And the script, it picks up on this, that it was really the shared commitment to democratic values that slowly started to, build a stronger relationship.
The foundation.
Yeah, like that was the bedrock, that fundamental alignment.
Okay, so that's kind of simmering along, and then boom, 2014, Crimea gets annexed, And the script, it flags this as a major turning point, and rightfully so. But what shifted so dramatically in that moment?
I think it was a moment where the world, and especially the U.S., like had to really reassess Russia's intentions,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, they're serious.
Exactly, and their willingness to act on them, because it was so blatant, right? It was a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, their territory.
Walking right in.
And the U.S. response, the sanction, increasing the military aid, all that, it signaled, I think, a deeper alignment. Like, it wasn't just shared values anymore. It was like, we got to push back against
It became real.
Yeah, it became very real. And you can see the seeds of, the kind of support we're seeing today. It starts there.
It's the beginning, for sure. And then, fast forward, we get 2022, and it's the unthinkable, right? The full-scale invasion. And the script mentions that this basically launched Ukraine right to the top of the U.S. foreign policy agenda. Over $75 billion in aid committed.
Yeah, it's astronomical.
What does that tell us? Like, when you see that level of investment, what's the message there?
I think it speaks to the U.S. recognizing how high the stakes are. And not just for Ukraine, right? But for Europe, for the whole kind of idea of a rules-based international order.
Right.
Like, you can't just, redraw borders by force.
Yeah.
And I think the sheer scale of the invasion, the brutality, it was a shock. So the U.S. response, it reflects this conviction that, Ukraine's right to exist, its borders, these are principles worth defending.
Yeah.
And also there's this element of deterrence, right? Like, we got to make sure this doesn't happen somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. Set a precedent. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the aid. The script highlights, systems like HIMARS, Patriot missiles as pretty crucial. Can you break down why those weapons specifically have been so impactful?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to their precision and their ability to kind of negate some of Russia's advantages.
Like level the playing field a little bit.
Exactly. Like HIMARS, for example, when those came in, it was a game changer because suddenly Ukraine could hit targets way behind the front lines.
Like disrupt supply chains?
Yeah. Command posts, logistics, stuff that they just couldn't do before.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about having more firepower. It was about, being able to reach further.
Changing the strategy.
Totally. And then the Patriot missiles, they're defensive, right? So
Yeah.
they're protecting against ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, protecting civilians, infrastructure.
Essential stuff.
Yeah. So it's a huge boost to Ukraine's defense.
All right. But this flow of aid, it hasn't been completely smooth sailing, right? The script points to that $60 billion aid package in 24 that hit some serious snags in Congress. What were the main factors behind that?
Well, the script mentions Ukraine fatigue,
Yeah.
and I think that's real,
Yep.
right? It's this sense that among some lawmakers, some of the public, that, this has been going on for a while.
People get tired.
Yeah, and maybe domestic issues should be the priority. And beyond that, it's also about, are we clear on what the goals are? Like, what are we trying to achieve? And is it actually achievable?
Right, right. Doubts creeping in.
And then there's the whole, risk of escalation, especially with certain weapons that, theoretically could hit deep inside Russia.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
That's a combination of factors.
And of course, there were people pushing back against those delays, and the script mentions this concern that if you withhold aid, it'll just embolden Putin. Walk us through that argument.
The idea is that, uh, any sign that the West is wavering, like if the aid slows down, Russia might see that as an opportunity, right? Like, okay, they're losing interest, let's push harder.
Seize the moment.
Yeah, and that could really hurt Ukraine's ability to defend itself,
Mm.
and potentially drag the conflict out on Russia's terms. So it's about showing commitment, making sure Ukraine can keep resisting.
Maintaining that united front.
Exactly.
Now, the Pentagon, according to the script, their stance was that the aid is carefully calibrated to support Ukraine, but without starting World War III. How do they walk that tightrope?
It's a constant balancing act, right?
Yeah.
They're evaluating what weapons, how much, what are the rules for using them, how will Russia react. It's complicated.
A lot of moving pieces.
Yeah. And the goal is to give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself, but also, avoid anything that could be seen as a direct threat to Russia, like something that could trigger a wider conflict.
Like poking the bear too hard.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a delicate situation. Definitely. But, the support goes beyond just the military, right? The script emphasizes that the U.S. is also funding things like hospitals, schools, energy grids.
Oh, absolutely. And
Yep.
that's crucial, right? Because war, it impacts every part of society.
Tears it apart.
Yeah, and supporting these civilian systems, it's not just about immediate relief. It's about, um, keeping the country running,
Right.
making sure people can survive. So it's a recognition that this fight, it's not just on the battlefield, it's about Ukraine's survival as a nation.
It's at people's lives. And, we got to talk about the human cost. It's, it's immense. The script mentions 14 million displaced Ukrainians. That's hard to even grasp.
Yeah, it's staggering.
Is the current level of aid, do you think it's enough to really deal with a crisis of that magnitude?
It's a huge question, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the U.S. and its partners, they're providing a lot, but the needs are so vast,
It's a constant need.
Shelter, food, medical care, mental health support. It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And whether the current level is enough, it's tough to say. It probably depends who you ask, but it's a massive challenge.
No doubt. And then you have the rebuilding effort, right? Like thinking long term.
Yeah.
The script gives an estimate of $486 billion,
Oh, wow.
which is, where do you even begin with a number like that?
It's almost unimaginable, the scale of it.
Yeah.
And getting that level of funding, it's going to take a huge international effort sustained over years. The U.S. has been pushing its European allies to step up, contribute more.
Sharing the burden.
Yeah, but there's been some pushback from some EU countries, so it's a big question mark. Like, will the money be there in the long run?
It's a big if. And there's this interesting point in the script about Ukrainians, some of them worried about becoming a forever client state. What's the thinking behind that?
It's understandable, right? Like,
Yeah.
they're incredibly grateful for the support, but they also want to be truly independent, in control of their own destiny, self-sufficient.
Yeah. And there's this fear that relying on aid for too long, it could, undermine their sovereignty in the long run. So it's this tension between like needing help to survive now, but also wanting to be self-reliant in the future.
A delicate balance.
Right.
Okay, let's tackle a tough one, corruption. The script acknowledges that this has been an issue in Ukraine, and it's a concern for donors, obviously.
Hmm.
How does the U.S. try to make sure the aid isn't being misused?
They've got a few mechanisms in place, like, independent audits so they can track where the money's going. And they've got people on the ground monitoring things.
Keeping an eye on things.
Yeah, making sure it's being used for what it's intended for.
Checks and balances. And what about Ukraine itself? The script mentions Zelensky firing officials linked to scandals. Is that a real sign of progress, or is it just, window dressing?
It's a mixed bag, right? I mean, Zelensky's actions, they show he's at least trying to address it.
Yeah.
But trying to implement big reforms during a war, it's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, priorities. The focus is on survival, on defense. So the question is, can you really make progress on something like corruption when you're fighting for your life?
Yeah,
It's it's a tough one.
definitely. Shifting gears a bit, the script talks about these growing cultural ties between the U.S. and Ukraine with, refugees coming to the U.S., Ukrainian communities growing. What's the significance of that, like in the bigger picture?
I think it's about building understanding, empathy. Like when
Yeah.
you have Ukrainians living in the U.S. sharing their culture, their stories, it makes the conflict real for people in a way that, news reports maybe can't.
It personalizes it.
Yeah, it humanizes it, and that can have a real impact on public opinion, on support for Ukraine.
Makes a difference. Now, on the topic of public opinion, the script highlights this Pew poll showing that a decent chunk of Americans are against more aid, and there's this pretty stark partisan divide.
Yeah.
What's driving that, the opposition, and why the split along party lines?
Yeah. Well, part of it is probably that Ukraine fatigue we talked about.
Right.
And then there's the economic concerns, like how much is this costing us, and are we getting anything out of it?
Right.
But the partisan divide, I think that's more complex. There used to be more agreement on supporting allies, but now, different political groups, they have different views on what the U.S. role should be in the world.
Different worldviews.
Yeah, and how we should use our resources.
All right, let's look ahead. The script has this section, Deep Dive, Future Prospects, and it brings up some big questions. NATO membership for Ukraine, it's discussed, but there are obstacles, potential vetoes from members, the threat of Russia retaliating. How realistic is that, do you think, in the near future?
I mean, NATO's said they're open to it, but with the war going on, it's just not happening right now.
Right.
And even if the war ends, you've got countries like Hungary that might block it, and Russia's obviously against it. So in the short term, I think it's highly unlikely.
It's a long shot. So if NATO's a distant possibility, the script mentions the U.S. may be offering security guarantees to Ukraine. What would those look like, and how effective could they be?
It could be a lot of things, like promises to provide military equipment, training, or maybe more general security cooperation.
Like a framework.
Yeah. And while it wouldn't be the same as NATO's collective defense, it could still deter Russia, and it would show that the U.S. is committed to Ukraine's security.
It's a signal.
But how effective it would be, it really depends on the details. What exactly are the guarantees, and how much will Russia believe that the U.S. will actually follow through?
It's about credibility.
Exactly.
Now, the script points out that joining the EU, that's seen as a more immediate goal for Ukraine. Why is that?
The EU offers a path to deeper ties with the West. Economically, politically, you get access to their market, you have to implement democratic reforms, and it's a way for Ukraine to be part of Europe.
Integration.
Yeah. And while it's a long process, it's seen as more achievable, maybe less provocative than NATO.
Yeah. Less likely to set off alarm bells.
Exactly.
Okay, last big point, and it's kind of the wild card in all of this, right?
Yeah.
Future U.S. elections. The script suggests that a change in leadership could lead to, pushing for peace talks right away, maybe on terms that aren't so great for Ukraine. How much could a new administration change things?
It could be huge, honestly. Like, a new president could have totally different priorities, change how much support Ukraine gets, what kind of support.
The complete 180.
Yeah. And if they push for negotiations without making sure Ukraine gets its territory back, its sovereignty, it could have massive consequences for the country and for the whole region. So yeah, it's a big unknown.
Lots of uncertainty. Now, the script has this myth versus fact section, which I think is really helpful. One myth it tackles is that U.S. aid is just a blank check for Ukraine. What's the reality there?
The reality is that something like 90% of the aid money actually stays in the U.S. It's used to buy weapons from American companies, so it's boosting the U.S. economy, supporting jobs.
So it's not just charity.
Exactly. And that's something that people often forget when they talk about foreign aid.
Right. It's a two-way street.
Absolutely.
Another myth the script addresses is that Ukraine can't possibly win this. What's the counter-argument to that one?
Well, the fact is that Ukraine has already taken back a lot of territory that Russia captured, like over half.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah. And that shows how resilient they are, how determined. And it shows that the international support is making a difference.
It's having an impact.
Now, whether they can achieve a total victory, that's a different question. And a long stalemate is definitely possible. But to say they have no chance, that's just wrong. Their morale, their will to fight. Those are huge factors, and they're still going strong.
So it's not over yet.
Definitely not.
Well, this has been a really insightful look at the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, thanks to this podcast script. It's clear that it's complicated, right? And the future is anything but certain.
Definitely. Understanding the history, it's key to making sense of what's happening now. And the debates about aid, they show just how tough the decisions are.
Lots of factors at play.
And then you have the human cost, the corruption. It's a multi-layered situation.
For sure. And for anyone listening who wants to dig deeper or maybe even lend a hand, the original podcast mentions UNHCR and Razom for Ukraine.
Yeah, great organizations.
And we always encourage you guys to subscribe, share your thoughts, keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
Now, here's a thought to chew on, right? Since U.S. policy can change so much depending on who's in charge, what does long-term allyship even mean in the grand scheme of things? And how can a country like Ukraine, plan for its future with that in mind? It's a pretty profound question. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody.
Thanks for listening.